Thus the exiles of Númenor established their realms in Arnor and in Gondor, but ere many years had passed it became manifest that their enemy, Sauron, had also returned. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be continuing our Timeline of Arda series as we discuss the coming of the faithful to Middle-earth, the founding of their kingdoms there, and the end of the Second Age with the War of the Last Alliance. If you are new to this series or need a refresh, please check out my Timeline of Arda playlist in the description and cards, as well as some articles and other related videos therein. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today, I appreciate it. Now let's begin our tale. We begin where we ended in the last video in this series, with the downfall of Númenor. Ar-Pharazôn had led his king's men to their doom in the west, during their folly in rebelling against the Valar. Sauron and many Númenorians left on the island drowned in the disaster, as Númenor itself was destroyed by Eru. However, the faithful Númenorians, led by Elendil, the Lord of Andúnie, and his sons Anarion and Isildur, escaped on ships and flew to Middle-earth from out of the western seas. In 3320 of the Second Age, they came to Middle-earth. Elendil and his men would come into the lands of Gil-galad and Eriador, in northern Middle-earth, for indeed Elendil was an elf friend, and the elves would aid him and his men in founding a new kingdom, that of Arnor. Arnor would span from the Lune River in the northwest to the rivers Gwathlo and Horwell in the southeast and east, and from the Great Sea in the southwest to the Etten Moors in the northeast. I have always wondered how the borders and jurisdiction of Elendil's kingdom met those of Gil-galad's kingdom, as Elendil's kingdom was in between Lindon and Rivendell. But at this point, many elves had left the lands of Middle-earth, deserting their homes in places like Aregin due to war, while others had perished in such wars. And perhaps the wide and uninhabited lands were granted thus to Elendil to establish Arnor. The major cities or outposts within this kingdom were Annúminas, the original capital of Arnor at this point in time, Fornost, a city that would later become the capital, Aman-Sul, later known as Weathertop, a watchtower of the Dunedain, Tharbad, an old Númenorian port city on the Gwathlo River, and likely Vignalande, the old refuge of Aldarion the Númenorian. The Arnorians dwelt near to elves and the middlemen of those lands, such as the Dunlendings and men of Bree-land, and they likely mingled with those folk of Middle-earth as well, as time went on. Now Isildur and Anarion, however, came to the south, where was Pelargir, a settlement of these faithful Númenorians, and they continued up the river Anduin until coming to a peaceful land between the White Mountains and the Mountains of Shadow. It was there they established the Kingdom of Gondor, and its borders were quite expansive indeed, south along the Great Sea, north to near the Falls of Rauros where the Argonath would eventually be built, from the west and the river Isen, to the Mountains of Shadow in the east. Gondor would be ruled jointly by Isildur and Anarion, but Elendil was still the High King of both kingdoms, although he was more concerned with his own kingdom of Arnor in the north. Their great cities and outposts would be Pelargir upon the Anduin River, Osgiliath, the capital of Gondor at that time, Minas Anor, which would be the future capital, Minas Ithil, which would one day fall to the Nazgûl, Aglarond, which would eventually be known as the Hornburg of Helm's Deep by its keepers, the men of Rohan, and Angranost, eventually called Isengard, by its future ruler Saruman and all others. Like the men of Arnor, the men of Gondor would dwell nigh to the middlemen, such as the men of the White Mountains, the Dunlendings, and the men of Rovanion, the ancestors of the Rohirrim. They would also live near the Druedain, the wild men of the woods. But they would be further away from most of the elves, except for those who dwelt near the sea, or at the elf haven of Etheland. The men of Gondor would also begin to mix their blood with the men of Middle-earth. As for the relics that came with the men of Númenor from that island, Narsil and the Ring of Barahir would be carried by Elendil, but Elendil would also use the scepter of Andúnie as the scepter of Annúminas, the symbol of kingship in Arnor. The sapling of the White Tree, however, would be planted by Isildur in his city of Minas Ithil in Gondor. As for the Palantíri, the Master Stone would be set in Osgiliath, while others would go to Minas Anor, Minas Ithil, and Angranost or Isengard, 4 for the southern kingdom, and 3 would go to Arnor, 1, the most powerful of the Arnorian stones at Aman-Sul or Weathertop, 1 at Annúminas, and 1 at the White Towers of the Tower Hills near Lindon. These 3 white towers were built by Gil-galad for Elendil, and the Palantir, the Elendil stone that was placed here, was used by Elendil to look to the uttermost west, but even Elendil could never see fallen Númenor, to his sorrow. And so it was that the kingdoms of the Dunedain, the men of the west, were thus established in Middle-earth. However, the darkness that had spread in Númenor was not fully gone from the world, For a time, it had only gone into hiding. Umbar, a haven of the Black Númenóreans under the sway of Sauron in the far south, was still held by such foes of the west, who waited for their master's return. The Nazgûl, wherever they were surely preparing. Sauron, too, had not perished his final end in Númenor. No, his spirit endured, and though he lost the ability to take a fair form, he could still take up power in Middle-earth. Whether or not his ring was with him in Númenor is actually up for debate, for if it was, his spirit carried it back to Mordor, but what is more likely is that he left his One Ring in Barad-dûr in Mordor for safekeeping, and took it up once more upon his return to Middle-earth. Sauron would not announce his return for some time, however, and there were years of peace for the West. During such peace, Isildur would meet with the men of the White Mountains at the Stone of Erech, a large and heavy stone brought out of Númenor and placed on a hill in southwest Gondor. The men would swear by the stone that, if Sauron would ever return, for that was on Isildur's mind, they would fight against him with the men of Gondor. Indeed, such a time would come, and in 3429, over 100 years after the founding of Gondor and Arnor, Sauron attacked Minas Ithil, the home of Isildur, suddenly, with orcs and likely men of the south and east at his call. Fortunately, Isildur and his family escaped the capture of the city, and Isildur saved another sapling of the white tree he planted before it was burned. The War of the Last Alliance had begun, and Sauron hoped to destroy Gondor while it was still young, while he thought it was still weak. But nay, it was strong already, and while Isildur brought word by ship down the Anduin and out to sea to the lands of Gil-galad and his father Elendil in the north, Anarion of Minas Anor held back the forces of Sauron from Osgiliath, while the West united and made ready for war. I imagine Isildur at this point, during his travels to the north, called on the men of the White Mountains for their aid, but they broke their oath instead, having worshipped Sauron during the Dark Years. Isildur cursed them, saying they should not know peace until they fulfilled their oath at last. Finally, Isildur made it with his family to the northern lands of Eriador. For elves and men and dwarves, Sauron had much to answer for, even just for his deeds throughout the Second Age. So it came to pass that in 3430, Elendil and Gil-galad formed their great alliance, and Durin's folk of Khazad-dûm joined this cause, as did King Amdir of Lorinand, or Lothlorien, and King Orifer of the Greenwood. But between Elendil the Elf-friend and Gil-galad, who had always been friendly to the Númenóreans, who had good hearts, there was a special alliance and friendship. Elendil, invoking the name of Iru-Ilúvatar himself, bound the alliance in an oath, which was a powerful and reverent thing that only the King of Númenor could do. The firstborn and secondborn children of Ilúvatar were bound together. The hosts of Gil-galad joined with the forces of Elendil at Aman-Sul, and from there they made their way to Imladris in 3431, where they made ready for war for 3 years, making plans and armor, all while Anarion held the forces of Sauron at bay. And as it often was with Gondor, by the blood of their people were the lands of the west kept safe. Isildur's wife and youngest son Valandil, who were with Isildur in the north at this time, would stay in Rivendell, and Isildur would attempt to return to them after the war was over, while his other older sons came with him to war. Finally, in 3434, the armies of the north were ready, and they were so mighty in their coming over the mountains that none could harry them. Sauron burned the gardens of the Entwives and the Brownlands to hinder them, but it did little. The forces of Elendil and Gil-galad were then strengthened by the elves of Lorinand and Greenwood, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Eventually, they joined with Anarion and the Gondorians in the south, who had been fighting for 5 years at this point. I might also imagine that the middlemen of Rovanion may have also joined in the battle against Sauron. Indeed, nothing like this combined force of elves, men, and dwarves had been seen since the Elder Days, since the War of Wrath and the Nernaeth Arnoediad. For unlike the War of the Elves and Sauron, the West was ready and united on their own terms. And so the Battle of Dagorlad broke out, and though many were slain, such as Kings Amdir and Orifer, and many of their forces, Sauron and his armies were pushed back into the very heart of Mordor. Minas Ithil would be reclaimed, and so began the siege of Barad-dûr that lasted 7 years. Anarion, king of Gondor and son of Elendil, would be slain during this siege, but eventually, in 3441, Sauron was forced to come forth and face the combined might of the Free Peoples. Indeed, Sauron, the lieutenant of Morgoth, the enemy of the Free Peoples, would be laid low by Gil-galad and Elendil, but at the cost of their lives as well. Gil-galad, last High King of the Noldor, a glorious living reminder of the elves of the Elder Days, was no more. Elendil, leader of the faithful and High King of the Men of the West, was ended. And so Isildur, Elendil's heir, cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger with the broken sword of his father Narsil, while Elrond and Círdan stood nearby, and the new High King took it as a wargild, payment for the lives of his beloved brother and father. Isildur would not listen to counsel, for as Elrond would say an age later, it should have been destroyed then and there, but the One Ring endured, just as the spirit of Sauron himself would. In the years after getting the ring, Isildur would write his scroll that Gandalf would read an age later. But the war was won and the last alliance disbanded. Sometime after the war, Isildur would bring some men to the hill Eilennir, later known as Amon Anwar, to make a memorial and tomb for Elendil there. The Second Age was at an end, and though Sauron was defeated, much was lost that could not be recovered. Númenor, the height of Eregion, Celebrimbor, Anarion, Elendil, Gil-galad, and many others were lost forever to history. In year 2 of the Third Age, Isildur would plant the sapling of the white tree he rescued from Minas Ithil in Minas Anor, in remembrance of his dear brother. He instructed his nephew Meneldiel, son of Anarion, and then left him the rule of Gondor, while he would go to Arnor and rule there, as his father Elendil had, although he was still the High King of both Arnor and Gondor, just like his father. But on his way back north with his men, Isildur and his sons, who had gone to war with him, were ambushed by orcs in the disaster of the Gladden fields. His men would be slaughtered except for his esquire Otar, who escaped and brought the shards of Narsil and likely the Ring of Barahir to Rivendell. Isildur put on the One Ring, becoming invisible, and attempted to escape while swimming across the Anduin, and the One Ring would betray him, getting lost in the river, slipping off of his finger. Isildur would be slain by orc arrows, and would never come to Rivendell again. Valandil, Isildur's last surviving son, would be the king of Arnor in the north after Isildur's death, while his cousin Meneldiel ruled in Gondor. And that is where we will end today's Timeline of Arda video, at the beginning of the Third Age. Although much sorrow had occurred, Middle-earth was still secured from Sauron for a time, but the cost to defeat him had been high, and such a force to stand against him would never be seen again in the world. From this tale we should remember that peace and freedom are never free. The defeat of Sauron and the peace that followed cost the lives of many great folk, and such sacrifices and history must be respected and always remembered. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections concerning this part of the Timeline of Arda? Let me know in the comments below. For me, it is definitely a sorrowful but amazing tale, that so much that was fair in Middle-earth should be lost just for a temporary defeat of Sauron at the end of the age. But it was necessary to stop him then and there before he could accomplish the goal that he had throughout the Second Age, to destroy the elves, corrupt, enslave, and kill men, and dominate Middle-earth. He had to be stopped. I also find that this is an interesting culmination of all of the battles he had with the different races throughout the age. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for a podcast and Discord server. All of those links are in the description below. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De La Torre, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Bootnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scout, Tobias Goldner, Ryan Ramsey, Merton, John Hume, Tom Bombadil, Reggie93, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, and our newest Valar tier patrons, Quantum Catalyst and Elizabeth Calvert. Thank you all so much, and thank you to all of my patrons. It means a lot. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with another What's Different video for the Return of the King. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.